Hi, I'm Rachel. And the night my father stood up at my own birthday dinner and told 22 relatives that I should shut down my little office and go beg my brother for a real job, I just sat there smiling because I already owned the building his precious company was renting from. Nobody in that room knew it yet. Not my mother, not my brother David, not the aunts who kept whispering about my sad little consulting firm in that sad little building downtown. I let them talk. I always let them talk. That's the part nobody understands about me. I've spent my whole life being the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who pays and never gets thanked, and I used to think that made me small. It took me a long time to understand it was the opposite. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who love you, technically, and felt completely invisible? Where are you listening from right now? Are you in your car after a long shift, or lying in bed scrolling because you can't sleep? Or maybe folding laundry with the phone propped against a basket? Wherever you are, I want you to know this story is real. The names are the only thing I've changed. And if it feels familiar to you, if you've ever been the responsible one who never gets the credit, I think you're going to feel this one in your chest. Before I keep going, if this kind of story means something to you, hit subscribe. It's free, it costs you nothing, and it's the only thing that tells me to keep telling these stories instead of quietly giving up on this channel. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning because you need to understand who I was before you understand what I built. I grew up in a mid-sized town outside Columbus, Ohio, in a brick house with a crooked porch step my father never fixed, in a family where love was real but attention was rationed like it cost something. My brother David was born 2 years before me, and from the moment I have any memory at all, David was the one people watched. He was loud, he was funny at dinner parties, he brought home trophies, and later when he became a regional sales director at a mid-sized logistics company, he brought home a title that made my parents' friends nod with approval. I was different. I did my homework early. I balanced my allowance in a little notebook. I was the kid who noticed when the electric bill was due and reminded my mother before she got the shut-off notice. Nobody called that impressive. They called it Rachel being Rachel. There's a specific memory from when I was maybe 9 years old that I still think about. David had a school project, some diorama thing, and my father spent an entire Saturday helping him build it, cutting cardboard, gluing little trees, laughing together in the garage while I sat at the kitchen table doing my own homework alone because nobody offered and I never asked. I finished my project in about 40 minutes because I'd planned it out the night before, methodically, the way I did everything, and when I showed it to my mother, she said, "That's nice, honey," without really looking up from the stove. I didn't cry about it. I just noticed it, filed it away the way I filed everything away, and quietly decided that if nobody was going to hand me their attention, I would build things sturdy enough that attention would eventually have no choice but to arrive. By the time I was 22, I had a business degree, a decent job at a small accounting firm, and a habit of watching how money actually moved instead of how it looked like it moved. That habit is what saved me, eventually, though I didn't know it yet. I worked at that firm for 4 years, learning everything I could about small business finance, tax structuring, and how ordinary people quietly build wealth without ever showing it off. I watched clients who looked poor on paper own real estate free and clear, and I watched clients who looked rich carry debt so heavy it would have kept me up at night. I learned that what a thing looks like and what a thing is are almost never the same, and I filed that lesson away without realizing how much I would need it later. My favorite client back then was an older man named Walter who owned a laundromat on the wrong side of town, wore the same flannel shirt every time he came in, and had, it turned out, quietly amassed almost $2 million in municipal bonds and paid off real estate over 3 decades of nobody ever suspecting a thing. He used to tell me, "Rachel, the parking lot doesn't pay you interest. The deed does." And I used to nod along politely without fully understanding what he meant until years later, standing in my own modest office looking out at my own unglamorous parking lot, when the phrase finally clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. I think about Walter more than I think about almost anyone else from that period of my life, because he taught me without ever meaning to that dignity and net worth do not always travel together in the way the world assumes they do. At 26, I did something my family considered borderline reckless. I quit my stable job to start my own consulting practice, helping small business owners with bookkeeping, tax prep, and financial cleanup. I rented a modest office on the second floor of an old brick building on Fenwick Street, above a shuttered print shop and next to a dentist who'd been there since the 80s. The room was small, the carpet was the color of weak coffee. The window looked out over a parking lot instead of a skyline. My mother visited exactly once, stood in the doorway for maybe 90 seconds and said, "Well, it's cozy," in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. That was the first time I felt the particular sting of being quietly written off by my own family, and it would not be the last. What none of them knew, because I never told a single soul outside my lawyer and my accountant, was that 18 months before I signed that lease, I had already bought the building. Not rented a corner of it, bought it. The whole 4-story brick structure at 214 Fenwick Street, purchased through a small LLC I'd formed called Fenwick Holdings, using savings I'd built quietly for years, a modest inheritance from my grandmother that I never mentioned at family dinners, and a commercial loan I qualified for. Because my credit and my numbers were clean, in a way almost nobody's are at 26. I bought it because the building was undervalued, because the location was about to improve once the city finished a streetscape project 2 blocks over, and because I have always believed that real security doesn't come from what people see you carry, it comes from what you quietly own. I remember the closing like it was yesterday, sitting in a county recorder's office that smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, signing document after document with a pen the title company gave me that I still keep in a drawer at home. My hands were shaking, not from doubt, but from the strange private thrill of doing something enormous that nobody else knew was happening. I drove past the building that same evening alone and just sat in my car across the street for almost an hour, staring up at the dark windows of the second floor, thinking, that's mine now, all 4 stories of it. The leaky gutter and the crooked fire escape and the faded lettering above the old print shop entrance, all of it quietly, legally mine, while my family was at that exact moment probably at my parents' house eating dinner without me, not even wondering where I was. It took me almost a year to find tenants for the other 3 floors, a physical therapy practice, a small graphic design studio, and a tutoring center that later became relevant in ways I couldn't have predicted. I handled the first year of leasing myself, nights and weekends, learning commercial lease law out of library books and late-night phone calls with Megan, my attorney, because I refused to hire a property manager until the building could comfortably support one. I did all of this while telling my family absolutely nothing, not because I enjoyed the secrecy for its own sake, but because I had learned, through years of quiet observation, that revealing an unfinished thing to my family only invited premature judgment, and I wanted this particular thing to be finished, solid, undeniable, before anyone got the chance to shape my feelings about it. So when my mother stood in the doorway of my cozy little office and pitied me, she was standing inside an asset I controlled outright, one that was already worth more than the truck my father still owed 4 years of payments on. I didn't correct her. I didn't say a word. I just smiled and offered her coffee because that's who I am. I don't perform my wins, I just build them, brick by brick, quietly, the way I bought that actual building, brick by brick, without a single person clapping for me. The Sunday lunches at my parents' house became the stage where the difference between David and me got performed over and over, like a play nobody thought to cancel. My mother would set the table with the good plates whenever David was coming, and just the everyday ones when it was only me. I noticed. I never said anything, but I noticed. My father would ask David detailed questions about his quarterly numbers, his new hires, his company car, and he'd lean forward like he was genuinely fascinated, elbows on the table, nodding along. Then he'd turn to me, ask how the little office was going, and before I could answer more than a sentence, he'd already turned back to David to ask a follow-up question, as if my answer had evaporated the moment it left my mouth. It wasn't cruelty exactly, not at first. It was something quieter and somehow worse, a kind of casual erasure, the sense that my life was a pleasant hobby they tolerated while David's life was the real news. My Aunt Carol used to ask me every single lunch whether I'd thought about going back to a real firm, somewhere with, and she'd actually say this, some structure. I'd smile and say I was happy where I was, and she'd give me the look people give you when they think you're coping rather than thriving. Nobody asked about my client list. Nobody asked about my revenue. Nobody asked if I was profitable because nobody assumed I could be. I remember one particular Sunday with unusual clarity, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it captured the pattern so perfectly. David had closed some mid-sized regional account that quarter, nothing that would have meant much outside his company's internal newsletter. But at dinner, my father asked him to walk everyone through the whole negotiation, step by step. And David did, gesturing with his fork, clearly enjoying the audience, while my mother refilled his water glass without being asked. Later that same dinner, when my cousin mentioned she'd heard I picked up a new client, some kind of manufacturing company, my father said, "Oh, that's nice," and immediately asked David whether he thought the Federal Reserve would raise rates again, as though my actual answer to the actual question about my actual client was simply beside the point. Background noise between the courses. I used to drive home from those dinners with the radio off, just sitting in silence, replaying the small cuts, not because any single one of them was unbearable, but because the accumulation of them over years had a weight that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. I'd sit at red lights, turning invisible little moments over in my mind. The way my mother said little office instead of office. The way my father's eyes would glaze slightly whenever I started a sentence within my business. The tiny, almost imperceptible ways an entire family can communicate to one person that her life matters less than everyone else's without a single person ever saying an unkind word directly. What made it harder was that I was, in fact, thriving. By the time I turned 28, my consulting practice had grown from 3 clients to 41. I'd hired a part-time bookkeeper named Jessica to help manage the workload, and Fenwick Holdings, my little LLC, had appreciated in value by nearly 60% thanks to that streetscape project finally finishing. I was, by any honest measure, doing better financially than my brother, who leased a car he couldn't really afford and carried a balance on 2 credit cards that I happened to know about, because he'd once drunkenly asked me to help him consolidate debt, and then never followed up because admitting he needed my help clashed with the story our family told about the 2 of us. That's the detail that used to keep me up at night, if I'm honest, not the teasing about my office. The fact that David had come to me privately for financial help more than once, and our parents never knew, and I never told them because I don't use people's struggles as ammunition, even when I probably could have. I helped him restructure a car loan. I helped him figure out a payment plan when he got behind on his mortgage 2 winters ago. I never asked for thanks, and I never got any. And at every single family dinner that followed, he sat there being praised for his big important title, while I sat there being pitied for my small, quiet business, holding a secret that could have flipped the entire dynamic of that table in about 4 sentences. I started paying for things too, small things at first. When my parents' water heater died, I quietly transferred the money to cover it and told my mother I'd found a coupon through a client. When my nephew Tyler needed tutoring to catch up in math, I paid the monthly fee directly to the tutor and let my sister-in-law believe the school was providing it for free. I did this not because I wanted secret credit, but because watching my family struggle with money while pretending they weren't struggling was its own kind of grief, and helping quietly felt like the only kind of help I was allowed to offer without it becoming another thing they used to feel sorry for me about. I remember the water heater specifically because of how small the moment was and how large it felt inside me. My father called, embarrassed, explaining that the old one had finally died after 22 years and that the plumber wanted $1,800 for a new unit installed, and I could hear him doing the math out loud on the phone, wondering if they should just get cold water fixed instead and put off the real repair until spring. I told him I'd ask around. I knew people in the trades through my clients, and then I quietly called the plumber myself, paid the invoice directly, and told my father a family friend had gotten him a discount. He thanked the imaginary friend more warmly than he had thanked me for anything in years, and I sat in my car afterward in their driveway, engine running, feeling a complicated mixture of relief that they had hot water again and a small, private ache that I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding petty. The tutoring for Tyler mattered even more to me, honestly, because I remembered exactly what it felt like to fall behind in math in 6th grade and have nobody notice until report cards came out. Tyler was quiet like me, the kind of kid who absorbs stress instead of announcing it. And when my sister-in-law mentioned offhand that he was struggling and that private tutoring was simply not in the budget right now, I called the tutoring center that same week, set up a direct billing arrangement under a name that wasn't mine, and told them not to mention it to anyone. Tyler brought his grade up from a D to a B over that semester. And at Thanksgiving that year, my brother David actually said, right in front of everyone, that the school must have finally gotten its act together with extra support programs, and I just passed the cranberry sauce and said that was wonderful, because some kinds of pride you have to swallow quietly at your own table with your own family, and nobody ever tells you how heavy that particular meal actually is. The strange arithmetic of my family was this: the less visible my help was, the more comfortable everyone felt accepting it, and the less visible my success was, the more comfortable everyone felt pitying it. I used to lie awake some nights doing the math in my head, literally doing the math, adding up the water heater and the tutoring and the time I quietly paid off my mother's overdue property tax bill so the county wouldn't put a lien on the house, and then subtracting it against the number of times anyone had asked me a real question about my work, and the second number was always so much smaller, it almost felt like a joke. I want to be clear about something. Because I don't want you to think I hated my family. I didn't. I loved them. I still do. That's actually what made it hurt so much. If I hadn't loved them, their indifference would have just been mildly annoying. Because I loved them, every dismissive comment about my cozy little office landed somewhere soft, somewhere that had been trying its whole life to be seen by exactly those people and kept missing. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being the reliable one. The one nobody worries about, because everyone assumes reliable people don't have needs, don't have wounds, don't sit in their car afterward and just breathe for a minute before driving home. By my 29th birthday, I had over 60 active clients. I'd hired a second part-time employee, and Fenwick Holdings, the LLC nobody in my family had ever heard the name of, held not just the building I worked in, but 2 other small commercial parcels I'd acquired the year before at auction. I was, quietly, doing extraordinarily well. My birthday dinner that year was held at my parents' favorite steakhouse, the kind of place with dim lighting and heavy menus, and a small private room they reserved every year for exactly this occasion. 22 of us crammed around 2 long tables pushed together. My mother's centerpiece of dollar store balloons bobbing awkwardly near the ceiling fan. I want to walk you through that whole night in detail because it's the night everything finally cracked open, and I think you deserve to actually be in the room with me rather than just hearing the summary. Dinner started fine, ordinary, my uncle telling the same fishing story he tells every year, my cousins comparing notes on some reality show, my mother fussing over whether the waiter had brought enough bread. About 40 minutes in, conversation drifted, as it always did, toward David, who mentioned that his company was in talks about a promotion that would come with, and he said this like it was the biggest news in the room, his own reserved parking spot. Everyone made appropriate sounds of admiration. My father actually clapped, once, like David had just landed a plane. Then my father turned to me, and I remember this so clearly it almost hurts to repeat it. He raised his glass a little, smiled the way he smiles when he thinks he's being charitable, and said, "And how's the little office treating you, Rachel? Still just you and one part-timer in there?" I said it was going well, actually, growing steadily, and before I could add anything else, before I could mention Jessica or the new client roster or anything real, my father turned back to David and asked whether the new parking spot would be covered or open air, and the entire table's attention swung back to my brother like a tide going out, leaving me standing on the sand alone, mid-sentence, my birthday candle still unlit on a cake nobody had brought out yet. That would have been bearable on its own, honestly. I'd absorbed smaller versions of that exact moment my whole life. But then my father, 2 drinks in, warmed up by the attention David's parking spot had generated, turned back to me with a look I now recognize as the specific, dangerous confidence of a man who thinks he's about to say something helpful. He said, "You know, Rachel, and I'm only saying this because I love you, that little space you're in, above the old print shop, it's embarrassing, honestly. It looks like a place people go out of business in, not where people go to succeed." He said maybe it was time to close up shop, admit the whole solo thing hadn't panned out the way I'd hoped, and go ask David if there was an opening at his company, something with structure, something respectable, before I got too old to start over somewhere real. I remember the exact texture of that moment, the ice clinking in my father's glass as he set it down, the way the whole table went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something they think is generous but everyone else can feel is cruel. My Aunt Carol laughed first, a short, uncomfortable laugh, the kind that escapes before you can stop it, and then a few of my cousins laughed too, not because it was funny, but because laughing felt safer than sitting in the silence my father had created. My mother didn't laugh. She just looked at her plate, rearranging a piece of asparagus with her fork, and said nothing, which somehow hurt more than if she had laughed along. I sat there for a moment, birthday girl, 29 years old, in a private room my parents had rented, being told in front of 22 relatives to shut down the business I had built with my own hands and go work under my brother. I felt my face go warm, that specific humiliation heat that starts at your collarbone and climbs into your ears. And I felt the old, familiar urge to defend myself, to list my client count, to mention the 2 employees, to somehow make the numbers loud enough to drown out the pity in the room. And then, underneath all of that heat, something else arrived, something calmer, almost amused because I thought about 214 Fenwick Street, about the building my father had just called embarrassing, about the fact that I could, if I wanted to, have ended that entire conversation with 4 words. I own the building. I didn't say them. I smiled instead, picked up my water glass and said, "Thanks, Dad. I'll think about it." And the conversation moved on, because that's what conversations do at family dinners. They move on, leaving the wound behind like a stone dropped in a lake, sinking slowly while the surface goes calm again. Driving home that night, still in my birthday dress, I cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady tears sliding down while I sat at a red light 2 blocks from my own apartment, gripping the wheel, thinking about the fact that I had just turned 29 years old, and my own father had suggested at my own birthday dinner, in front of everyone who mattered to me, that my life's work was an embarrassment worth abandoning. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't post anything, vent to a friend, or even write it down. I just sat with it, let it settle into my chest like sediment, and somewhere in that quiet, furious grief, a decision started forming that I wouldn't fully understand until months later. The decision to simply stop explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen and let time and paperwork and patience do what my words apparently never could. Things shifted, slowly at first, in the spring after that birthday, in the months before everything came apart. David's company promoted him to regional director, a title with a nicer office and a company card, and the family celebration for that promotion lasted for what felt like 3 consecutive Sundays. My mother printed out his new business card and taped it to the refrigerator right next to the grocery list, like a small shrine. I remember standing in that kitchen looking at the card, David Whitman, Regional Director, embossed letters, and feeling something in my chest that wasn't jealousy exactly. It was more like grief for a version of appreciation I was apparently never going to get no matter what I built. Around that same time, David mentioned casually over dinner that his company was outgrowing its current office space and that his boss had asked him to help scout new locations downtown. I remember my stomach tightening slightly, not because I suspected anything specific yet, but because Fenwick Street had exactly the kind of affordable, up-and-coming commercial space a growing company would look at. And David worked 2 miles from my building without ever once in 3 years asking what street my office was on. That's how separate our lives were. He didn't know where I worked, not the address, not the building, nothing. I want to pause here and just say something to whoever's listening right now, because if this story is landing for you the way I think it might, I want to ask you a favor. If you've made it this far, if some part of this is scratching at something true in your own life, drop a comment telling me where you're from or just one word about how this is making you feel. It helps this channel more than you know. It's free, it takes 10 seconds, and honestly, hearing from you is the only real payment I get for staying up late writing these down. Okay, back to it. My mother started a new habit that spring, inviting herself over to my office under the guise of checking in, but really, I think, to gather material for the next round of gentle mockery. She would walk through my modest waiting area, glance at my one office plant, and say things like, "You know, you could ask David if there's room for you at his company. They're expanding. You wouldn't have to worry about all this overhead." I would explain, again patiently, that I had over 60 clients and 2 employees, and that overhead was not exactly my problem. She would nod in the way people nod when they've already decided not to hear you. The mini avalanche started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear. I'd stopped by my parents' house to drop off groceries, another quiet thing I did every other week without announcement, and I heard my father on the phone with David laughing, saying something like, "Well, if the numbers work out, maybe you can finally get her out of that dump and into something respectable. You know she'd never say no to you. She never says no to anyone." I stood in that kitchen holding a bag of groceries I'd paid for, listening to my own father plan my professional rescue from a building he had no idea I owned. And something in me went very, very still and very, very clear. I didn't confront him that day. I want you to understand that this is not a story about a woman who blows up at the dinner table the second she gets hurt. I have never operated that way, not because I'm passive, but because I've learned that reacting in the heat of humiliation almost always costs you more than it gets you. I put the groceries away, I hugged my father goodbye, I drove home, and I sat in my car in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes just breathing, letting the anger move through me like weather because I already sensed somewhere underneath the hurt that something bigger than an insult was coming, and I wanted to be steady when it arrived. That night I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Megan Price, who had handled the Fenwick Holdings purchase from the very beginning and who, over the years, had become something between a lawyer and a friend. I told her what I'd overheard. I asked her calmly what would happen if David's company approached Fenwick Holdings about leasing space in my building without knowing I was the owner. She was quiet for a second, and then she said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "Rachel, if that happens, the paperwork will do the talking for you. You won't have to say a single word, and honestly, that might be exactly what this family needs to finally see you clearly." I hung up the phone that night with a strange, settled feeling I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not yet, just clarity. For years, I had absorbed my family's casual dismissal, like a tax I paid for the privilege of staying close to them, quietly covering bills, quietly correcting nothing, quietly letting David be the star. But underneath all that quiet, I had built something real, something with a foundation, literally, and for the first time, I let myself imagine what it might feel like if the truth simply arrived on its own, in writing, with a county seal on it, and did the explaining I had never once been given the floor to do myself. 3 weeks later, my property manager, a steady, detail-oriented woman named Lauren Ortiz, who handled the day-to-day leasing for Fenwick Holdings, so that my name rarely appeared on anything my tenants actually saw, forwarded me an inquiry email. It was from a commercial leasing broker representing a company looking to lease roughly 2,200 square feet of second-floor office space in a mid-sized building near downtown, ideally with room to expand within 18 months. Lauren didn't know the connection yet. Why would she? And I read the broker's email twice before I even let myself register the company name listed as the prospective tenant, Whitman Regional Logistics Solutions. David's employer. I remember sitting at my desk in my actual cozy little office staring at my monitor, feeling the strange vertigo of watching a coincidence assemble itself into something almost too neat to be real. Fenwick Street had 3 vacant second-floor units at that exact moment, one of them directly adjacent to my own suite, the very space my father had joked about David rescuing me from. I told Lauren to proceed exactly as she would with any prospective tenant, professionally, thoroughly, through the standard leasing process, and to keep me updated as she normally would, giving away nothing about why my voice sounded a little tighter than usual on that call. Over the following 2 weeks, the broker scheduled walkthroughs. I made sure I was out of the building each time, working from a coffee shop 2 blocks away, sipping coffee I didn't taste, checking my phone every few minutes for Lauren's updates. She told me the client loved the location, loved the exposed brick, loved the proximity to the new streetscape improvements the city had finished, the same improvements I'd been quietly betting on years earlier when nobody else saw the value in that stretch of Fenwick Street. It was surreal hearing my own investment thesis repeated back to me through a broker who had no idea whose building he was praising. I remember sitting in that coffee shop one particular afternoon, laptop open, pretending to work on a client's quarterly filing while actually just staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes, replaying every single comment my family had made about that building over the years. My mother calling it cozy, my father calling it a dump, my Aunt Carol asking if I'd thought about a real firm with some structure. And here was David's own company, sight unseen as far as the family connection went, choosing that exact building out of every available commercial space in the entire downtown corridor because the numbers, the location, and the bones of the place were simply better than anything else on the market. There was a strange, almost dizzying justice in that fact alone, long before David ever set foot in the hallway and realized whose name was on the deed. I called Megan that week just to talk it through, not because I needed legal advice exactly, but because she was the only person who knew the whole truth, and I needed someone to help me stay steady. She reminded me, the way she always did, that I didn't need to engineer anything, I didn't need to nudge the outcome or tip my hand early, I just needed to keep running Fenwick Holdings exactly the way I always had, professionally and quietly, and let the natural process of a standard commercial lease do what it was always going to do anyway. Sometimes, she said, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Just keep being exactly who you already are and let everyone else catch up to that fact on their own schedule. Meanwhile, at home, the family noise around David's expansion grew louder. My mother called to tell me, with real excitement in her voice, that David's company was looking at a wonderful new space, so much nicer than what I had. And wouldn't it be wonderful if David ended up right in that same neighborhood? Maybe he could even help me find something better nearby once he settled in. I said that sounded nice. I did not mention that I already knew, in granular detail, square footage and proposed lease terms and everything, exactly which neighborhood David's company was circling, because I owned the block. The pressure kept building in small, almost comic ways. My father brought up twice in 1 week a mutual acquaintance whose daughter had, quote, finally gotten serious and taken a real job at a real company, as though ambition only existed in the shape of someone else's org chart. My Aunt Carol asked at a cousin's baby shower whether I'd thought more about David's offer to, and again I want you to hear the specific words, put in a good word for me at his company once he got settled into the new office. I smiled, said I'd think about it, and drove home, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary, counting down, without fully admitting it to myself, toward whatever was coming. Lauren called me on a Tuesday afternoon with the update that changed the pace of everything. Whitman Regional Logistics Solutions wanted to move forward. They'd chosen the unit directly beside my own office suite, and their leadership, meaning David's regional vice president, and notably David himself, wanted to schedule a walkthrough with ownership present before signing, a fairly standard request for a company committing to a multi-year commercial lease. Lauren asked if I wanted her to represent Fenwick Holdings at that meeting instead of me, since that's typically how I preferred to operate, staying invisible behind the LLC. I sat with that question for a long moment, phone against my ear, looking out my window at the parking lot my mother once called uninspiring. Then I told Lauren no this time, I'd attend the walkthrough myself. She sounded a little surprised since I almost never inserted myself directly into tenant meetings, but she didn't push. She just said she'd coordinate the date and send over the standard ownership disclosure paperwork ahead of time. The document every prospective tenant's leadership team reviews before signing, the one that plainly states, in black and white, the legal owner of record for 214 Fenwick Street. I remember driving home that night with my hand steady on the wheel for the first time in weeks, not because the anger was gone, but because I finally understood the shape of what was about to happen. I wasn't going to storm into a family dinner and announce anything. I wasn't going to raise my voice or demand credit I'd been denied for a decade. The truth was simply going to walk into a scheduled leasing meeting wearing a suit, carrying a clipboard, and it was going to introduce itself to my brother in the most ordinary, procedural, undeniable way possible. Through a piece of paper he would have to sign his own name underneath. The walkthrough was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 10:30, and I dressed for it the way I dress for any serious client meeting, a charcoal blazer, simple jewelry, hair pulled back, nothing flashy, nothing that announced anything because I've never needed to look important to be important. Lauren met me in the hallway outside the vacant unit 20 minutes early, folder in hand, and asked one more time if I was sure I wanted to be there in person. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything, and we walked in together just as David's regional vice president, a tall, brisk man named Gary Holden, arrived with 2 colleagues, and a step behind them, my brother David in his good suit scrolling his phone, not even glancing up at first. David looked up when Gary greeted Lauren, and his eyes slid past me the way they always had, politely, briefly, the way you look past a stranger in a hallway, and then his gaze snapped back, confusion flickering across his face for a half-second, before he covered it with a laugh. "Rachel," he said, "what are you doing here? Are you working in this building now, too?" And there was something almost pitying in his tone, like he assumed I'd taken some administrative job in the same block as his company's exciting new expansion, further proof in his mind that our lives simply orbited different levels of importance. I told him, simply, that I was there for the ownership walkthrough, and I watched confusion deepen into something else on his face, something searching. Gary Holden, oblivious to the family drama unfolding in real time, shook my hand warmly and said he was very much looking forward to finally meeting the owner of Fenwick Holdings, said he'd heard wonderful things about the responsiveness of the ownership group during lease negotiations, and asked if the actual owner would be joining us or sending a representative. Lauren, beside me, said simply, "She's right here," and gestured very naturally toward me. I wish I could fully describe my brother's face in that moment because words don't quite hold it. It wasn't just surprise, it was the visible, physical experience of an entire internal narrative collapsing at once. The story he'd told himself his whole life about which sibling was the serious one, which sibling needed rescuing, which sibling's office was a joke, and which sibling's title belonged on a refrigerator. David actually said, out loud, "Wait, what? You own this building?" And Gary, still oblivious, laughed and said, "She owns 3 buildings on this block, David. I did my homework before we got here. Fenwick Holdings has quite the little portfolio downtown." We walked through the vacant unit as though it were a completely normal commercial showing, Lauren pointing out the updated electrical panel, the exposed brick David's own broker had praised weeks earlier, the proximity to the new streetscape improvements, and the entire time David trailed slightly behind the group, quiet in a way I had genuinely never once seen him be at a family gathering. I noticed small things about him in that unit that I'd never had the occasion to notice before. The way he kept glancing sideways at me instead of at the room, the way his easy, room-filling confidence, the exact confidence that used to swallow all the air at family dinners, seemed to shrink to almost nothing inside 4 walls where I quietly held all the power. At one point, Gary asked me a direct question about whether Fenwick Holdings would consider a tenant improvement allowance for build-out costs, and I answered him clearly, citing the actual numbers I typically offered, $6,200 toward improvements amortized over the lease term, standard for a space this size in this market. I watched David's face while I said it, watched him realize in real time that I wasn't guessing or performing competence. I was simply stating facts about my own building the way I'd state facts about anyone's taxes, calmly, from memory, without a single note card. It was, I think, the first time in his adult life he had ever watched me operate inside my actual expertise, instead of hearing about it secondhand through my mother's dismissive summaries. Near the end of the walkthrough, Gary pulled out the standard ownership disclosure and lease intent document, the same one every commercial tenant reviews before formal lease negotiations begin, and he asked casually if I wouldn't mind initialing the ownership section while we were all together, just to streamline things for legal. I took the clipboard, and I want you to picture this exactly as it happened. I signed my name, Rachel Whitman, Sole member, Fenwick Holdings LLC, in the exact same handwriting my brother had seen on birthday cards our entire lives, right there on a legal document that stated in plain typed language that I was the record owner of the building his company was about to lease space inside of. The same building our father had mocked 2 months earlier at my own birthday dinner, suggesting I abandon my dump of an office and beg my brother for a real job. David asked to speak to me privately for a moment, and we stepped into the hallway while Gary reviewed floor plans with Lauren. He asked me, quietly, almost stammering, "How long? Since when? Why didn't you ever say anything?" And I told him the truth, plainly, without cruelty, that I never said anything because nobody in our family had ever once asked me a real question about my work that wasn't secretly about when I planned to give up. I told him I wasn't hiding a secret to embarrass anyone later. I was simply living my life at the pace and volume that felt true to me, and it wasn't my job to compete for a spotlight that had never once been offered to me anyway. If you're still with me right now, I have to say, this is usually the part where I hear from people the most. So if this moment is hitting you the way I think it might, go ahead and drop a comment. Tell me what you would have said standing in that hallway. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe. It's free. It genuinely helps me keep finding and telling stories like this one, instead of letting this channel quietly fade out. Okay, let's go back to that hallway, because the hardest part was still ahead. David asked, very quietly, whether our parents knew, and I told him no, nobody knew, not even him, until about 4 minutes ago. He asked if I was going to tell them now, and he paused before he found the word spite, and I told him no, I wasn't going to tell them anything, because I had never once needed to perform my success for people who couldn't be bothered to ask about it, and I certainly wasn't going to start now just because the truth had finally become impossible to avoid. I told him the paperwork would do whatever talking needed doing, and if our parents wanted to understand who I actually was, all they had to do was pay attention, something none of them had done in a very long time. Word travels fast in a family like mine, and it took exactly 4 days for my mother to call me, her voice strange and careful, asking if it was true, if I really owned that whole building, if I really owned 2 others besides. I told her yes, calmly, the same way I would answer a client asking whether their quarterly numbers were accurate. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that told me everything about how the last decade had actually worked in that house. She said, "Why didn't you ever tell us? We would have been so proud." And I had to sit with that sentence for a full 10 seconds before I could answer her, without my voice shaking, because the truth was, I had been quietly proud of myself for years, waiting for a version of pride from them that apparently required a signature on legal paperwork to finally arrive. The lease, in the end, did not go through. Whitman Regional Logistics Solutions leadership decided after some clearly uncomfortable internal conversations that leasing office space from their own regional director's sister created what Gary Holden delicately called a perception issue for a publicly reporting parent company, and they chose a different building 4 blocks over instead. David lost the exact unit he'd been so excited about, the one with the exposed brick and the ideal square footage, not because I blocked it. I never said a single word to Fenwick Holdings' leasing team beyond ordinary professionalism, but because the truth of our relationship made the arrangement too complicated for his own employer to sign off on. My father called me about 2 weeks after that, and it was, without exaggeration, the first time in my adult life he had asked to speak with me one-on-one, not through my mother, not at a family gathering, just the 2 of us on the phone on a Sunday afternoon. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I said some things at your birthday I shouldn't have said about your office, about you working for David, and I didn't know," and I told him, gently but honestly, that not knowing wasn't really the problem. The problem was that he'd never once asked, that he'd built an entire opinion of my life out of a glance at a small waiting room and a habit of comparing me to my brother, without ever checking whether the comparison was even true. He apologized, really apologized, not the kind of half apology where someone explains themselves more than they take responsibility, but an actual, halting, uncomfortable apology, the kind that costs a proud man something to give. I accepted it because I'm not interested in punishing my father for the rest of his life over one bad night, but I also told him clearly that things were going to be different going forward, that I would no longer be quietly covering bills or tutoring fees or property taxes without acknowledgement, not out of spite, but because I finally understood that my silence had let everyone build a version of me that was smaller than the truth, and I wasn't willing to keep funding that illusion. My mother took it harder in some ways, mostly because she had to sit with the specific memory of standing in my office doorway, calling it cozy in that particular tone, knowing now that she'd been standing inside a building worth more than most of what our family owned combined. She apologized too, in her own way, by suddenly wanting to know everything: my client list, my growth numbers, how Fenwick Holdings got its name, and I let her ask. I answered honestly, but I didn't perform extra warmth I didn't feel yet, because respect that only shows up after the numbers are proven isn't quite the same as the respect I'd actually wanted all along. There was one afternoon, about a month after the walkthrough, when my mother came by my office unannounced again. The way she used to, except this time she stood in that same doorway and looked around the same waiting room with an entirely different expression on her face. Something closer to shame than pity. She asked if she could sit down, and I gestured to the chair across from my desk. The same chair. 41 clients, and then 60, and then well over 100 had sat in over the years. She said quietly, "I think I only ever saw what I expected to see, not what was actually here." And I told her that was probably true of most people, and that I understood it even if it had taken years to stop stinging. She cried a little, right there in my office. The office she'd once called cozy in that tone, and for the first time in my life I let myself simply comfort her instead of managing my own hurt in silence. Because forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't require forgetting. It just requires deciding what you're going to carry forward and what you're finally going to set down. David and I talked more in the month after that walkthrough than we had in the previous 5 years combined. He admitted quietly, one night over coffee at my actual office, sitting in the same cozy waiting room our mother had once pitied, that some part of him had always leaned into being the impressive one, because it was easier than examining whether his actual finances were as solid as his title suggested. I told him I already knew that. I'd helped him consolidate a car loan once, remember, and he laughed, a real laugh, maybe the first honest laugh we'd shared as adults, and said he supposed I'd known who he really was long before he knew who I really was. He also told me something that night that I hadn't expected, that he used to feel a strange, guilty pressure every time our parents praised him at my expense, that some small part of him always noticed how quiet I'd get afterward, and that he never said anything because saying something would have meant giving up the easiest seat at the table, the one where he didn't have to work very hard to be the favorite. I appreciated the honesty more than I expected to. It didn't erase a decade of Sunday dinners, but it gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. The simple confirmation that I hadn't imagined any of it, that the imbalance had been real and visible even to the person benefiting most from it, and that naming it out loud finally mattered more than either of us expected it to. Things at family dinners changed after that. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just quietly, the way most real change actually happens. My father started asking me real questions about client retention, about how commercial real estate valuations worked, actually listening to the answers instead of glancing toward David halfway through my sentence. Nobody called my office cozy again, not because the carpet got nicer, it didn't. I never even bothered to replace it. But because the word had lost its power to diminish something everyone now understood was worth considerably more than it looked. I also started showing up differently at those dinners, not louder, not showier, just steadier. If someone asked how work was going, I gave a real answer instead of a shrinking one. If my father tried out of old habit to pivot a conversation back toward David before I'd finished a thought, I'd gently finish the thought anyway, calmly, without apology, and I noticed over time that the table adjusted to that new rhythm, the way tables eventually adjust to anyone who stops making themselves smaller. It wasn't revenge, it was just, finally, an accurate room. Here's what I want you to take from all of this, if you take nothing else. Being underestimated is not the same thing as being small. For years, I let my family's version of me exist unchallenged, the quiet daughter, the modest little office, the sister who probably needed rescuing, and I let it exist because correcting people felt exhausting, and because some part of me believed that real value should be obvious without explanation. I was wrong about that second part. Sometimes you have to let the paperwork speak. Sometimes you have to let time and patience do the explaining. You're too tired to keep doing yourself. But you should never mistake someone's failure to see your worth for proof that the worth isn't there. If you are the responsible one in your family right now, the one who pays quietly and gets thanked rarely, the one whose wins get skipped over at the dinner table while somebody else's title gets printed out and taped to the refrigerator, I want you to hear this clearly from one quietly stubborn woman to another. What looks small to people who never bothered to look closely is very often the actual foundation everything else is standing on. You do not owe anyone a performance of your success to make your success real. Keep building. Keep buying your version of that building, whatever it is for you, literal or otherwise, and trust that the truth has its own timing, even when it feels like nobody is watching. I'm not angry at my family anymore. Not really. I understand now that they didn't see me because they never learned how to look, and I've decided that teaching them slowly, patiently, was worth more than punishing them. But I also stopped shrinking myself to keep their story about our family comfortable, and that changed everything, more than any building ever could. If this story meant something to you, if some part of you needed to hear that being underestimated is not a life sentence, do me one favor before you go. Subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, and it's the only way I know that these stories are actually reaching someone. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.